Good morning. Hi, everyone. Everyone looks so beautiful at 7:30 a.m. We're going to be doing more things and events at 7:30 a.m. because y'all look good. That works for us. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Peninsula Conflicts Resolution Center's ADRx Innovations in Strengthening Race Relations in Our Communities. My name, if you don't know me, is Michelle Vilches. I'm the Executive Director of the Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center, and it really is our pleasure to have all of you here today. I'm looking in the audience, and I see so many friends and partners of PCRC. This year, we are celebrating our 30th anniversary, if you can believe it. Yes. And it's in large part because of our partnerships. So the cross-sector collaboration of law enforcement and city government, county, nonprofit, faith community, community residents, youth, families, all working together ultimately to create a strong and vibrant community. And we work with individuals, groups, and institutions really to build relationships to help where there can create some understanding to ultimately reduce violence in San Mateo County. So thank you so much for your years of partnership and your years of innovation with us. I want to draw your attention, if I could, to the program that you have in front of you. You have a number of items that are in front of you, the program being one. I want to take the time to draw your attention to the very back page. We have some individual donors, along with Franklin Templeton Investments, who have donated to make today possible. So if we could just take a moment to thank them. We couldn't do this work without their support. Additionally, we have some board members in the room, and if I could just ask the board members quickly, I won't ask you to introduce yourselves, but if you could just stand so that we can recognize you as well. I very much depend on these members, and I really thank them for their leadership and their guidance on an ongoing basis, and I know that we have a couple of them here today. Thank you. So we have a tight program, a very packed program, and so I will definitely allow the program to get started. But before I do, I want to be able to say that a lot of planning has gone in today, and there's a number of individuals that really need to be thanked sincerely for making today happen. And there's one person in particular that I just want to thank from the beginning and not wait till the end. Zara Vahambati, who is my director of operations, has spent countless hours and sleepless nights and not very much medication anymore. But I really want to appreciate her for her leadership and her guidance, and she's worked very hard, so thank you, Zara. All right, so we're going to get started. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator. He is a phenomenal individual. Some may call him a poet. Some may call him a visionary. Others call him director because he oversees a number of initiatives. He's a community leader. He is a thought provoker. And the best part about him is that I get to call him friend. So please help me welcome Mauricio Palma as our moderator.
And I get to do that in front of her husband. Before I get started, thank you, Michelle. I just want to make sure that you read the last line in the slide so that you are engaged in the conversation, not just sitting down and listening, but participating and using technology to do so. You can agitate us, you can move us, you can raise your questions. So please make sure to write that down because that slide is going to disappear shortly. I'm really excited to be here. I know that sometimes when we talk about race, we go to a place where people often think we're done with that conversation. And there is fatigue in some circles around the conversation of race. But if you listen to the news, if you read the paper any day, at any time, which you can do 24 hours a day, you will come across an issue in education, housing, the issue of security, discrimination against one group versus the other. Anywhere you go, the state of our economy, it brings us back to this question of what's the relationship that it has with race? The way in which communities are brought together or separated, how is race present in those conversations? So I applaud you for coming. Be brave enough to be here in a Friday morning where you could be doing something else, to spend some time reflecting on the issues that our speakers are going to be sharing with us this morning. It's a critical conversation, and I'm glad that we're not fatigued, that we keep it in front of us, and that we do it with respect, and that we are doing it with a desire to do something about it. But I need to read in order to stay focused and in order for us to do this on time, respecting you and respecting the speakers who want to spend as much time as possible sharing their thoughts and their actions with us. So let me share with you a few words about the format. Each one of our great speakers are going to have an opportunity to share briefly their perspective on work, about 10 minutes each. We have 5 great speakers in total, so you can do the math. Are we okay? Bless you. You will have cards, if I'm not mistaken. They're already in front of you. Can we see how they look? Cards are going to be provided. You have them. Perfect. So those are not there just for you to doodle. You can do that. So if you doodle on one part on the back, pose your question, make your comment. Then at the end of the conversation, we'll have someone that's going to be getting the cards so that we can have our speakers address some of the questions. As you know, we don't have enough time for every question to be addressed. I think that the team that put together the event is reflecting on how to address the questions after the event if we didn't get to them. But just know that your questions are critical and they're important, so please make sure to write them down. And even if we don't address them today, please share them with us. The speakers are going to hang out, some of them afterwards, so you can also approach them. They're quite approachable, beautiful people, friendly people. They talk about very difficult issues, but they're easy to connect to, and they will be more than happy to share, those of them that are going to stay around. So I encourage you to please do so and have a conversation with them if at all possible. So to respect our time, we'll end exactly at 9:30. And the only thing I need to do right now is to ask you to please don't get rid of your cell phones. Use them. You know how. Tell the story of what's going on here today to others that are not able to be here today. There were so many that wanted to come that at one point the team had to say, stop. So please engage them through social media. Send your videos and your tweets, Facebook, Snapchat, whatever you're comfortable with. But if you need to take a call, please, there is a way to do so by going outside. It's a wonderful lobby out there. The one in the back would be the best way to go. Are we ready for the conversation? All right. So our first speaker is Dr. Shakti Butler. She is president and founder of World Trust Educational Services a nonprofit based in the East Bay that focuses on transformative educational work. Transformative educational work. I've had the pleasure of working with her in looking at the relationship of race and philanthropy. And she's a wonderful person to have as a way of getting the conversation started. So please help me welcome Dr. Chakti Butler.
How are you? You're good? Very good. This is my dad. My dad was born in 1890 in Barbados. And his dad was born in Austin, Texas, enslaved. That means my grandfather was a slave, not my great. My grandfather was enslaved in Texas. And he was emancipated when he was about 9 years old. And when he was 18, he took a boat to Barbados, where he met my grandmother, who was African and Arawak Indian. And my dad was a great storyteller. You can see his beautiful body here. He was also a fighter at one point. They called him One Punch Leroy. But he was also the first black Teamster ever hired in New York. This is my mom. My mom was born in 1911, 21 years my dad's junior, in Russia. And her family came to the United States to escape the pogroms. Her family disowned her when she married my father. That's kind of how it would happen in those days. So I grew up in Harlem, where in my household, we talked about race every day. But not only did we talk about race every day, everyone I knew talked about race every day, either directly or indirectly, because I grew up in Harlem. This is my second grade class, little brown schoolhouse. And the teacher was my favorite teacher ever, and she had the nerve to get married and have a child. And I have a lot to say about that. But this is my second grade class. And when I was in the second grade, my aunt took me to the theater to see Snow White. How many of you have seen Snow White? I was mesmerized by Snow White. And my aunt was very kind. She allowed me to stay and watch the movie 3 times. Do you remember what they said about Snow White when they described her beauty? What did they say? Her hair as black as ebony, her lips as red as cherries, and her skin as white as snow. I wanted to be Snow White, but there was no way I was going to be Snow White. There was no way that I could imagine myself really being Snow White, because this is not what I look like. Nothing in that movie reflected me, my family, or how I grew up. This was the first black show that we saw on TV, Amos and Andy. I would cringe when this show came on, because this was a show that was meant to be a comedy. But unlike Snow White, who was kind of a shero, there was no one in this program who was presented as intelligent, as thoughtful, as someone who actually represented leadership or courage. And media and the power of media as part of structure really informs our ideas on so many levels about who we are, where we come from, where we belong, and where we do not. So I have an organization called World Trust, and I have the good fortune to make films. I don't quite know how that happened. It's my 3rd chapter in my career. But because I know that talking about race is very important, and I know that films are absolutely critical in terms of spreading ideas to popularize education, I'm able in a film to talk about the system of racial inequity. Racial inequity is a system. Now, what is a system? A system is something that has a lot of moving parts and it has a specific job. So you could think about your human system, for example, when you think about an example of what a system is, and what is the job of your body? To keep you alive. And it does so without a lot of interference from you on many different kinds of levels. But when we think about racialization, the process of racializing and being racialized in the world in which we love and live, we have to talk about systems. We have to think about patterns and relationships. So what is this system? Our human system has all these parts, but it also has structures. So what are some of the structures in the human system? Your brain, your circulatory system, your digestive system, all of these structures that support the system in fulfilling its obligation. And the system of racial inequity is designed to churn out inequity. That's what it does. But we're not taught to think systemically about racism. We think personally, I'm a good person, I'm not a racist. All of which doesn't matter at all, because you can be the nicest people in the world, but if you don't understand how systems function, you can't position yourself to leverage change in the system. Does that make sense to you? So this system is embedded in history and culture and identity, but it's moved by power and economics. And it has internal components and external components. The internal components are bias, both conscious and unconscious bias. How many of you have ever taken the implicit bias test? So it's a great way to really see how the unconscious mind is thinking faster than the conscious mind. You know, in those cases where something pops out of your mouth and you go, oops, I shouldn't have said that, that is your unconscious mind overriding your conscious mind. It is the reservoir of information that you draw upon in order to categorize where things belong. Privilege, that's a hot topic, isn't it? We don't really like necessarily talking about privilege, but when you understand that the system of racialization, this system was created before you were born. This history was created before you were born. We step into the system and we are part of the system. And in order to make change in the system, we are recognizing that. But everyone in this room has privilege. Everyone who gets an education has privilege. Why is privilege important? Because it gives you access. And that access should be used for the higher good, where everyone has a chance to belong. Internalized racism, the messages that we get about who we should be or how we can be, often in competition with how we're being told, you can be anything you want. But this internalized process has deep impact. And we talk about these things, we talk about the driver of power and economics because history, culture, identity, and all these internal components play out in our external world. They play out in our relationships. They play out in our institutions and how we make laws and policies and rules that govern us. Or custom, that's just the way it's always been. And of course, it plays out in our structure, which is all of the above, but it is especially about the relationships among one institution to another. So the messages, the common messages that we get through our educational system, through our banking system, through our way that we deal with health, the way we deal with education, all of these things are related. Who's my timekeeper? 2 minutes, perfect. And so imagine my surprise, because people often ask me, how did you get to do the work that you do? It's my life. It's what I know. It's not what I set out to do. And given my beginning with Snow White, we understand that for me to be called by Walt Disney to work on Zootopia, because the film is intended to work with revealing bias and prejudice, I was floored. And I was also very happy, because it says that all of us, no matter who we are, no matter where we are, there are ways that we can drive the system if we come together, if we work together. And so I call this little talk that I just gave you From Snow White to Zootopia. And so this is what we have to analyze. These are the tools we have to analyze the system with. So thank you.
Thank you, Chuck.
You're welcome.
I would like to now welcome Orson Aguilar from the Green Lining Institute. I learned about Orson's work when I was part of the Peninsula Community Foundation, which some of you might remember, and didn't get a chance to work with him then. But when the merger occurred and the new Silicon Valley Community Foundation was developed, we had the opportunity of working with Hewlett Urban and Packard on an initiative called Community Leadership Project. And that initiative, in many ways, is connected to the work that the Green Lining Institute had developed, which is to advance transparency and greater diversity within the context of philanthropy. They are not afraid to push, and they are also respectful and bringing folks along in bringing about transformation at the system-wide level. So from a personal story to the systems work, welcome Mr. Orson Aguilar.
Good morning, Mauricio. Thank you for that kind introduction. Buenos dias. It's good to see so many of you here. Have to acknowledge my boss who's here, so I'll be on my best behavior. One of the founders of the Green Lining Institute, Hortensia Lopez, who is here from San Mateo with the El Concilio. Thank you. So just a little disclaimer, this is the first time I give this presentation, so let me know how it goes. So let's make America great again, right? Let's talk about race. So first about, basically I'm going to talk about my life and race and why I do what I do at the Green Lining Institute. So my parents are, I call them original Americans. They came here from Central America, came to this country like most of us, with the exception of indigenous people and African Americans who were forced here through slavery. But most of all of us came here from Europe or other places, India, looking for economic opportunity. That was my parents. And they found the land of opportunity here, Boyle Heights, East LA, a great neighborhood, has a great civil rights history that I'm really proud to be associated with. I was born and raised in East LA and now live in Oakland. So this is Sears, the place where my mom used to take me to go buy our Toughskins, because this was the only place, this was the only retail shop in East LA for many, many miles. I grew up in this housing project here. It's one of the biggest apartment complexes west of the Mississippi. Had over 10,000 people just in one apartment complex. Talk about like you want to ask for trouble with that many kids running around together, you're going to get trouble. And unfortunately, a lot of great memories there, but unfortunately, I'm also a product of the late 80s, early 90s. A lot of gang violence, homicides in LA were at their record high in 1992, when I happened to be 18. So that picture up there is a homicide in the Wyverwood Apartments where I grew up. I grew up in a very homogenous neighborhood. I thought we were mainstream because everybody was Latino. Like we were it. Like this is what America looked like. This is, like I didn't understand the stuff on TV because you could drive miles and miles and miles, and maybe the few white people you would see would be maybe a few police officers, but even then, a lot of the police officers were Chicano or Latino, a few of the teachers, but you could go for miles and you didn't feel like an outsider. And I wasn't politicized. I grew up in the neighborhood. Nobody taught us our history. We were proud of who we were. And we had these profound images all around us. We had no idea what they meant. I was like, who is this guy? And how come I drive by him every day telling me I'm not a minority? Like, what are you talking about, dude? So fast forward, I'm very lucky, thanks to a race-based policy called affirmative action. I get my ticket out of the barrio. You know, I go from the barrio thanks to, again, a race-based policy that saw something unique in me. And I landed here, you know, UC Santa Cruz, right? And of course, I chose Santa Cruz because I thought they had the toughest mascot, the banana slug. So I'm like, my homeboys are going to be really proud of me when I come home with a banana slug tatted on my shoulder. Really, I got into UC Santa Cruz because that was the only UC that accepted me. So I was like, I'm in, I'm going. My friends were like, don't you even have to apply? I'm like, I applied, they just didn't know it. You know, I did it at night. And then after my first year, I didn't listen to my homeboy Steve back there, who was a mentor at UC Santa Cruz. You might get a little emotional. I never really talked about this. So I make the mistake, I go back to East LA and hanging out with all the homeboys. And we packed the guns at the time. It was a crazy time. You had to just be ready. There was a fight. I ended up shooting somebody. I put another young person. Luckily, it wasn't serious. He got shot on the forearm. And so I'm speaking really fast here. I get sentenced to 6 months in jail, 5 years probation. And so all my homeboys are like, we're going to prepare you to go to jail. And it was really awful what they prepared me to do. They basically said, in jail, don't talk to black people. In jail, don't associate with African Americans. If an African American asks you for your juice or something you haven't eaten, you don't offer it to them. You offer it to your raza first. And for me, I was really uncomfortable with that because that's not who I was, right? It was just a really foreign, but I did it, you know. So I go to jail, thinking, you know, like I was wearing 3 sets of boxers because that's what they told me to do. And luckily, you know, I hustled. Those 6 months, I applied for parole. They never give parole for something, especially a serious crime like that. And basically, within a summer, I'm back at UC Santa Cruz. So this was where I was. My claim to fame was O.J. Simpson was there at the same time that I was there. And so I go back to Santa Cruz. And as you can see in Santa Cruz, there are no classrooms. You do your learning at the beach, in caves, in the forest, usually around some kind of cloud of smoke. The classrooms are just symbolic there. You know, you do the learning here. So all this experience with race, you know, good and bad, leads me to where I am today at this great organization that I'm the president of called the Green Lining Institute. And so Green Lining is a response to a race-based policy that was implemented by corporate America, sanctioned by our government, that said people of color in certain communities do not deserve certain things. You don't deserve mortgages, investments. And so we say, you know, we're going to talk about race, and we're going to encourage you to invest in these communities that have been formerly redlined. How am I doing on time, by the way? 3 minutes, great. And clearly you see we envision a nation where communities of color thrive and where race is never a barrier. So there's a huge assumption here, right, that race is a barrier to succeed in America, the land of opportunity. And so what do? I'm going to fast forward. So one is we talk about race through the press, through the media. This is a recent op-ed that was published in a variety of newspapers throughout the country, basically talking to the angry white men that are out there supporting a certain candidate, saying, relax, you are still very privileged. Dr. Butler gave an amazing presentation breaking down that white privilege. We do this, and I get a lot of great pieces of hate mail right after it. But we also want to talk about race with the highest levels of government. So this is me when I was about 25. I have my hand on Alan Greenspan's butt, and he's smiling. But I literally had a debate with Alan Greenspan in his conference room where the Fed makes these enormous decisions that impact the world about race. And I don't know if you were there, Hortensia, but it was, for a while, they were almost going to kick me out because they were like, we're meeting with Alan Greenspan. You don't do that. That's what we did, and it worked out, and I made him laugh, and we became friends. And then lastly, one of the things I want to point out is we encourage companies to really talk about race. And so there's anybody use Uber and Lyft? So if you can pick, choose Lyft, because Lyft actually has a commitment to diversity and inclusion. They have a partnership with us, and they are hiring their first ever person to look at diversity and inclusion. So I wonder if Franklin Templeton has a diversity and inclusion officer. Is that person here? Just checking. So let me leave you with this. We should all strive to be race conscious. We need a safe space to discuss race. And then we shouldn't jump on missteps. And really sometimes we have great white allies that want to talk about race, and sometimes people will mess up, right? Because we have this programming that's been to us. Let's not jump on that person. Let's be forgiving and teach that person so that they can be courageous to continue talking about race. And last, I'll leave you with this. If somebody says to you that they're colorblind, they basically are just blind. With that, thank you for letting me be here today. It's an honor to be on the stage with these great people. Thank you.
I think it worked, right? It worked. Thank you, brother. You went to a different Santa Cruz, though. That's not what I experienced in Santa Cruz. I went to classrooms and to the library. They have those there as well. Thank you, Orson. I would like to now welcome Sarah Bilo. I've had the pleasure of working with her over the past 3 years in the implementation of the Community Leadership Project. Sarah is the Executive Director of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Please help me welcome Sarah Bilo.
If you don't be quiet, I am going to rip that thing off your head. That is what a Silicon Valley high school teacher said to a Muslim high school student just a couple of years ago. I want to kill all of you. That is what William Selly yelled outside of a Richmond mosque last year. We need to patrol Muslim neighborhoods. We need to ban all Muslims from entering the United States. Oh wait, maybe just some Muslims, maybe just for a little while. That is what some presidential candidates have said in recent months. This young man seems to have visited some ISIS websites, but we don't know if he was radicalized. There is no evidence pointing to that yet. That is what the FBI said about the UC Merced stabbing suspect who was shot and killed months after his death without notifying his family of any reports. When we think of these stories, we think of a post-9/11 context. We often think of Tennessee, Arkansas, Florida, and others. But all of them have some connection to the Bay Area. Even the presidential candidates who I named have spoken in the Bay Area. This is not a East Coast or Midwest challenge. And though these examples are recent, I come to this work with a very personal experience, having had my headscarf pulled off when I was 10. And you may not know, but I was 10 a while ago. been some time. In thinking about pushing back against Islamophobia, I don't think of it as a small problem. I don't think of it as an isolated problem. And I'm not a speaker who memorizes statistics, so I won't give you very many. But 3. Over 50% of Muslim students in California public schools, that's 1 in 2, have experienced some form of bias-based bullying. And it doesn't end at home. It doesn't end at school. It follows them home on social media, on Snapchat, on Facebook, on Twitter. It impacts not only them, but also their peers who may identify with similar groups. And the worst part is it isn't just their peers. It is sometimes their teachers. That high school teacher in Silicon Valley who thought that it was acceptable to say that she would rip a student's headscarf off flabbergasts me. There is no other word to describe it. She continues to teach in Silicon Valley. There were more attacks on mosques and Muslim institutions in 2015 than in any other year we have documented at CARE. That included fake anthrax being mailed to the CARE office, which led to my staff having to be segregated, decontaminated, taken to the hospital, and put on CPRO until 36 hours later when they were told that they were cleared. That included the man who yelled at the mosque in Richmond, threatening to blow the mosque up and wanting to kill people. Police took weeks to go to his home for various reasons, and what they found when they got there, some would say, were the first steps towards making a pipe bomb. There were more hate crimes and hate incidents targeting Muslims and those mistaken for Muslim. And I mention this here because it's important to remember that the first person killed in a hate crime post 9/11 was not a Muslim. It was a Sikh American. Sadly, the people who are violent are also stupid. But maybe that makes sense. There were more hate crimes and hate incidents targeting Muslims and those mistaken for Muslim in the 2 weeks following the Paris attacks last year than in any other 2-week period since 9/11. And much of that violence happened right here in California, where a Department of Corrections employee attacked Muslims praying in Alameda County, where parents were hesitant about sending children to school for fear of their safety, where women had very real conversations about whether or not to wear their headscarves out in public, and where mosques had to hire armed security guards. So 3 statistics. Over 50% of California public school students have experienced some form of bias-based bullying. More attacks on mosques and Muslim organizations last year than any other year that we've documented. And more attacks on Muslims and Muslim individuals and those mistaken for Muslim in the 2 weeks following Paris and in any other 2-week period since 9/11. And it's not just the terror attacks. I could do another presentation about our double standards with the use of terrorism, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. It is oftentimes the rhetoric that connects the terror attacks to people who have nothing to do with them that lead to this violence. In the same way that it was the rhetoric that connected mass communities with individual crimes during the war on drugs and other times in our history that have led to discrimination and violence against those communities. In our work at CARE, we employ 4 strategies. We provide direct legal services to American Muslims and others facing discrimination. We push back against media narratives that falsely demonize entire communities. We engage with elected officials to ensure that they know what their Muslim constituents are thinking as they pass policies that impact all of our lives. And we work with our youth and community members to ensure that they have the tools to move us forward. In doing this work, we grapple with several tensions. You'll notice I use numbers and lists a lot. The first is that it doesn't just happen among right-wingers. Sometimes I am more afraid of CNN and MSNBC than I am of Fox News, because at least when we turn on Fox News, we know exactly what kind of trash we're going to get. But when CNN and MSNBC insist on using Islamic State or running the Egypt terror story all day yesterday, there is an impact that many of us don't expect. We consume Islamophobia in a very subtle way and sometimes don't even realize it. There are industries that are bigger than all of us that impact these things. The prison industrial complex has played a significant role in targeting Japanese Americans, in targeting African Americans, in targeting Latinos, and today in targeting the Muslim American community, which includes, of course, people from all of these racial groups and others. The military industrial complex, which is also bigger than everything combined sometimes. All of our universities, all of our social services. We spend more money on war than we do on ever helping people. And if we are going to continue to bomb people in Afghanistan and Yemen, then the trickle-down effect is that people who look like those people but live among us will be treated as suspect. Alone, we are all small communities. The Muslim community, by the most generous estimates, makes up 6 to 7 million Americans. That's it. Less than 2% of the American population. We cannot push back alone. We are not the only community to experience this kind of targeting. I tell Muslim women when I do work in my community that one's life is more in danger as a trans individual in a public restroom than as a visibly veiled Muslim woman on a public transportation vehicle. Other communities are being targeted too. So I never want to work under the illusion, and I never want to give the impression that I think we have it worse than anyone else, or that I think we are going at this alone. So what do we do? How do we push back? It's difficult for me to confess this, but I do it because I think it's important to recognize that we all have our own biases. I co-founded 2 initiatives to feed the homeless in our communities, one in San Francisco and one in Los Angeles. And yet, when I interact with people who are homeless, I sometimes catch myself clutching my bags a little bit tighter, worried about my safety. So the first step is recognizing our own bias. And if I have biases as someone who works to feed homeless people and works at the intersections of race and religious bias, I would argue that all of us do, but sometimes it's about coming to terms with them. The second is to get to know each other. I misspoke. I'll give you a 4th statistic, not just 3. Over 70% of Americans have never met a Muslim. When I talk to my Muslim communities, I say it's important that we ensure people can get to know us, but also that we get to know them. If all I am doing is talking about Islam and Muslims, but not learning about Christianity and Judaism and Sikhism and Hinduism and all of the other faiths and no-faith communities, then I'm not doing it right. But I ask my allies to do the same, to get to know us and to get to know each other so that we can learn about the mystery, so that we are not consuming information solely from Fox News, which I hope none of you are doing and didn't require me saying. And the last, I think the most important in being an ally is to push back where opportunities to push back arise. Something that gets forgotten here is to thank people. So to thank PCRC for including various communities and various voices in these important conversations. To thank friendly reporters in the media when they cover stories well. To thank teachers whose curriculum actually reflects the diversity of our communities. And to hold accountable those who are doing it wrong, whether it's the corporate media outlets that are working for a profit, or the presidential, but really more importantly, the city council and congressional candidates who are doing it wrong sometimes, right? And maybe where we can all make the most impact, our neighbors and friends. I won't sing Adele's Hello song for you, but I will ask that if you haven't seen it, you look for the SNL skit about her song at the Thanks-taking, and yes, I said Thanks-taking dinner table, and the impact it has in sometimes stopping a conversation and how important we can all be in stopping problematic conversations and saying, I know a Muslim, I know a Jew, I know a Black Lives Matter activist, I know a teacher, I know a police officer, and you can't judge all of them based on what one individual has done or what one media outlet says. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next presenter is Matt Hammer. He is the founder and CEO of Innovate Public Schools. If you've ever met someone who uses data to bring about change, you're about to do that today. Please help me welcome Matt Hammer.
All right, good morning. I was worried that I was going to go too long if I didn't read off some notes, so I'm going to stand back here. Thanks so much to the wonderful team at PCRC for all of your incredible work in the community. Thanks so much, Michelle. So my name is Matt Hammer. I'm white, which is important to know in case it isn't obvious or you can't see very well. Second thing to know for the purposes of this talk is that I grew up in a fairly wealthy family in a fairly wealthy community in San Jose called the Rose Garden. Not really rich, but fairly well off. And why this is important to know is because it tells you almost everything, not everything, but almost everything about the topic that I'm going to talk about today is the educational outcomes of children. So know that I said it tells you almost everything, but of course not everything. There were super boys and super girls among my Mexican friends and classmates growing up, kids who had to work way, way harder than me, who made it despite the odds. And there were, of course, some white kids in my school who never got to college. But those college-bound Mexican kids and those white kids without college degrees, they were largely the exceptions that proved the rule in my community. The schools I attended growing up were about 70% Mexican and Vietnamese and mostly low income. My parents had instilled in me this sense of pride in my ethnically and socioeconomically diverse K-12 public education. I gave one of the speeches at my graduation from high school, and I spoke proudly about how wonderful it was to go to Lincoln because it represented the great diversity of San Jose. So what's looking back on this sort of shameful about this scene, though, is that me, the white boy about to head off to a very fancy private university called Duke, me, the white boy whose dad was a prominent lawyer in town, who's on the school board, and whose mom would become the mayor, is that I was boasting at our graduation about how great Lincoln was, Lincoln High School was, not the president, how great Lincoln was, not really aware of the reality that the graduating class behind me in the bleachers as I spoke had shrunk dramatically over the years because of the huge dropout rate. And not really aware of the reality that there were only, at the time, 10% of us in my graduating class who were going on to a four-year university. And in front of me during my prideful speech was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families with hope, but also sort of brimming hope, but lessening about the reality of their children really being able to make it in this increasingly competitive and expensive valley. So I went off to college in the South and became fascinated with race and politics and the history of the struggle there. A bunch of my friends, we organized to get Duke to start doing more in the community and create a community service center, which I led as the director for a couple years after I graduated. We'd send lots of college students into the Durham public schools as volunteers. And I got to know a guy in town who called himself a community organizer. And one day he said to me, you know, Matt, it doesn't really matter how many of these fickle Duke students you send into the Durham public schools. They're really always going to be crappy until the people in Durham get themselves organized and demand that the schools be better. And so that gave me pause, really shook me up, started to think about that sort of so much for my big plans to change the world. And started learning about community organizing and decided that I wanted to go further into the South and try to find the toughest place that I could find or what I thought would be very tough in the US called the Delta of Mississippi. So I moved down there and was lucky to find some incredible mentors, people who'd been on staff with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the big, I'm supposed to press that button. There we go. Thank you. Who taught me about community organizing and what my role could be in helping African American communities to build power so that they could hold the system accountable to their needs. Really a totally incredible experience for a few years down there, learning about this place that I'd never known about and just very, 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 very intense racism in the rural South. And I was really transformed by that, really taken in by the African American community and taught how to do this kind of work. And I was really transformed mostly by the relationships that I built. So as I think back on my experience in public schools in San Jose, the really sad thing is that 30 years later, I'm getting just a little old, that reality from my childhood is still largely true today. But of course it is, right? Because deep social problems like this one only change and improve when the status quo is disrupted. Back when I was in high school, nobody really raised a peep about how few children of color went to college from my high school. And you know why? Because that was really what was expected by those who ran the school and taught there, by those who ran the district and ran the city. So many of my classmates had been tracked into low-level classes and the school was not pushing them. So many of my Latino friends got the explicit and implicit message that they really weren't college material, and nobody raised a peep, much less a roar about that. And so that subtle, quiet racism, also known as low expectations, call it what you want, it still exists very much today. So a close friend of mine teaches at a public high school not far from here with many Latino students. She was in a staff meeting not long ago, and when the discussion turned to how they might be able to get more of these kids into college, a teacher spoke up, no joke intended, and said, not all of these kids need to go to college. We need mechanics and people to mow our lawns too. Seriously, that statement went largely unchallenged. So if you know something about amazing public schools, what we call world-class schools, there are some of them in the Bay Area, schools where the vast majority of low-income kids are also getting prepared to succeed in college. What you know is that they hold this one thing in common. They have this relentless, fierce, uncompromising belief in the capacity of every single child to achieve academically at a very high level. And these radical, crazy, high-performing schools are built on that foundational value, so different than practically every public school around. And it is this deep insistence on the capacity of every child to grow, do good, be creative, think critically, produce at a very high level that really makes all the difference. And if the adults in the building don't hold that radical belief 100%, the school is going to be just another place, mediocre at best, where kids like me, who are already on a college path because of their families, will almost certainly go to college themselves. And kids who are not already on that college path, well, they're going to sort of have to make it on their own, pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Have a few exceptions, of course, but in general, when the school doesn't aim to get them in and have a program to do that, to get them into college, it just doesn't happen for the vast majority of them, and still doesn't. So here are just a few slides quickly that paint the picture in California. So this tells you that the majority of the kids in California are now low income, almost over 60%. And then kind of proud of this graph, if you can see it. Check out the report that's in front of you on top schools in the Bay Area. If you turn to the first page, you can study this a little bit more. We're kind of proud of this graph because it shows the interaction between race and income. And so at the top, you see that 84% of non-low-income Asian kids on the left are proficient in math on the new state test, which is a very good test. All the way down at the bottom on the right side are low income by ethnicity. You see that 17% of low-income Latino kids and 11% of low-income African American kids are proficient in math. That should disturb us deeply, deeply, because those kids are very unlikely to be able to make it in this valley. And then surprising data here, everybody assumes that in this rich valley, in the rich Bay Area, things must be a little bit better for low-income kids, and in fact, it's not. So actually, the Bay Area low-income Latino and low-income African-American kids actually do worse or the same, that's 17%, but in general do worse than low-income Latino and African-American kids in the rest of the state. So shame on us, we need to do much better. And here's just one high school that's not far from here, Menlo Atherton High School, that shows the massive achievement gap. So 20% of African American kids versus 88% of Asian kids are leaving Menlo Atherton eligible to go to a UC or a CSU. Check that out. And so what's, up to now I've been a bit of a downer, I'm sorry, to start your day off this way. The reality, though, is a lot of bad news. But while the big picture is depressing, there are some really incredible signs of hope. Schools like this. So you'll see in our report a bunch of happy graduates, and there are more and more happy graduates these days. When I was a kid, there actually was not a single public school, I'm pretty sure, where the vast majority of low-income kids were getting into college. We now have an ever-growing number of schools that are showing what's possible, including this list of high schools. So these are just high schools where the low-income Latino and low-income African-American kids are doing better than the average across the state for all kids. So it's one way of saying, are they closing the achievement gap? And there's lots of others of these kinds of lists in the report that we passed out. So it's really important to know that there really are some incredible models out there. What we're doing at Innovate Public Schools really is trying to build a movement for these kinds of world-class schools all across the Bay Area for all children. At the foundation of everything we do is this powerful feeling. It's a feeling that I hope nobody has had in the room, but I suspect many of you have had. When it's that feeling you have when you love a child, as practically every parent does, and you know that your child is in a bad situation, is in an environment that isn't good for her, or with adults that aren't treating her how she should be treated, who perhaps don't believe in your child or really know him or her. It's that feeling of fear and anger that can grow into despair. But it almost always starts as urgency. You want it fixed now when that appears in your life. So at the root of Innovate is that feeling that thousands and thousands of families have. Come home and chat with their wife or husband with that feeling, go to bed at night after a long day of work with that feeling of despair. So really the unfortunate thing is that if you want a world-class school for all children, you're going to have to engage in a political struggle. It's not just about politics, of course, but it is largely about politics. How else to explain that we now have these model schools, but so few of them? If we can create 50 amazing schools like this in the Valley, what else besides political will being in the problem that's preventing us from creating the next 50 and the next 50 and the next 50? And really it's because there are very strong political forces in play that are keeping these changes from happening. So at Innovate, what we're doing is trying to build the political will to do that through creating this kind of data and research. We also help low-income families to get themselves organized, to build power so they can hold school districts accountable to create more of these extraordinary schools. And then the other part of the organization is about helping teams of educators to actually launch and create new incredible schools like this. We have a Startup Schools Fellowship that works with both districts and charter schools to help to launch these kinds of great schools or turn around their very low-performing schools. So finally, just in closing, what does all this have to do with the question of today about how do we strengthen race relations? And I would say one big barrier to better race relations is that our neighborhood, social organizations, schools, are just so totally segregated. I went to an elite university that had so few students of color and low-income students, and as long as we doom the vast majority of our kids to a third-rate public education with little chance of going to college and being able to participate in the wonders of the economy in this valley, we will continue to be largely socially isolated and divided. But when our children attend excellent schools, have the opportunity to go to college and be able to make life choices about where they want to live and what their livelihood will be, that lays a foundation for people across all races to relate to each other on more equal footing, with more equal power, not just as the gardener mowing the lawn, as the lady said in the staff meeting, but as much more equals. And that's the kind of race relations that I want to be a part of creating. So thank you.
Thank you, brother. How are we doing so far? So help me welcome our last presenter, Grand Loom. who will be sharing about his work in Divided Community Projects, an organization that's dedicated to strengthening community efforts to transform division into action.
Good morning. My name is Grand Lum, and I want to start by saying when I went to Lowell High School in San Francisco, that's when I first thought about becoming a lawyer. And I thought I wanted to become the Asian American Perry Mason or Thurgood Marshall. I wanted to be a civil rights litigator, not a civil rights mediator. And to be honest, when I was young, I did not know the difference between mediation and meditation. So, where my original desire for fighting for justice came from, though, actually came from being a big superhero fan growing up. My brother and I collected Avengers comics, which now are worth quite a bit, thanks to the movies, thankfully. And that's where that desire came from. When I became a mediator, I actually still had some concerns about mediation, right, and about the power of listening in mediation, especially when it came to justice in racial disputes. I remember an early mediation that I did. It was in Boston Public Schools. It involved a white teacher and a black principal. And it had to do with a teacher evaluation. The teacher did not get an evaluation she thought was appropriate and filed a grievance against the principal. I was concerned. I was like, wow, can I really even handle the racial aspects of this? But I stuck to what I was taught as a mediator. I stuck to making sure to have each person tell their story, right? Listening to them, not interrupting them, which was kind of hard for me initially. I learned to do that, and then asking good questions. So at one point, I heard the teacher say, "We used to talk more." And I was surprised when I heard that. I looked over at the principal. She didn't flinch. She didn't react, which is typical, right? When any of us are angry, you're not listening. You're not listening fully whatsoever. So I asked both of them a question. It seems like you used to talk more. Why did that change? And the teacher teared up. She said, we started as teachers together at this school, and we used to be really good friends. But when she became principal, something changed. We started talking less. And the whole dynamic of that situation changed dramatically. The principals, she said, yeah, I mean, when I became principal, I didn't want to treat anybody as a favorite, and I got really busy, and they both agreed. It went from there, and they became enemies to a certain extent. But the room had changed, and they reconciled. The teacher dropped a grievance, and I look back at that situation and many that I've done in my career and say, well, going to court wasn't the right solution for them, right? And it was only because of listening and asking questions that they came to an outcome that was truly better for them. So I want to focus on what I call the superpower of listening. And especially now, right? As we watch the news and we see all the yelling that's going on, all the walls that are being built, and the demonization that's happening both online and IRL. Anybody know what IRL stands for? In real life. I just learned that. So, and over the last few years, I worked at an organization called the Community Relations Service at the Department of Justice. And our organization is really focused on civil rights disputes and on mediating the community conflicts that come out of it. Over the last few years, we have been going into communities like Sanford, Florida, and Ferguson, Missouri, to deal with that. And as you know, those were not easy places to work with. And to give you a sense of the scope of how big things have gotten over issues of African Americans being tragically shot by police officers, is to just look at social media. In the Washington Post, I saw a recent story about the 10 most influential social issue hashtags ever. Number 3 was hashtag Black Lives Matter. It had 12 million uses. Number 2 was hashtag Love Wins, about same-sex marriage. That had 12,700,000. At number 1 was hashtag Ferguson at 27,800,000 uses. It gives you a sense of how big these issues have become. And when I want to focus on listening, I also want to focus on what CRS did. That's what we did. We went to these communities and we listened. Whether it was playing a shuttle diplomacy role between a mayor and a protest leader who were refusing to talk to each other, whether it was mediating roles of engagement between a police chief and leaders of several protest groups. By rules of engagement, what happens if someone's arrested? Where are protest zones? What's allowable? All those issues that had to actually be figured out in these situations. And all we really did, all our staff really did, was listen and ask good questions. In much of that, it involved that. There was some recent research, just came out on April 8th in Science magazine. You guys may have heard of this research. It had to do with Prop 8, the same-sex marriage in 2009. And what the researchers initially proposed to do was to find out how you persuade people around deeply held biases, right? And most of the research tends to show that you can't. You cannot change people's biases. But this research did. And what they did was they had people canvassing and talking to individuals for 20 minutes. And they only had 20 minutes. And they were trying to, in that situation, in the original research, persuade them to support same-sex marriage. And they had an astounding result. And the astounding result was that they got 15% change in people supporting same-sex marriage. Not just over 3 months, not 6 months, but actually even a year afterward. As compared to 3% in this situation only. And when they got the 15%, it was when the canvasser said they were gay. And it was only 3% if they did not say that. There was only one problem with the study. One problem was all the data was falsified. It was entirely false data. This was huge in the social research world. But they did it, and it was found out by the researchers who were trying to replicate the study. And that's what they found out because they went to the canvassing group and they found that data was never found. But here's what's even more interesting about the follow-up research. They did follow-up research in Miami around a 2014 ordinance on transgender support. There was an ordinance that was passed to rid the city against transgender discrimination. They did a similar research, 20-minute conversation, and they were trying to get support for transgender rights. This time they found a 10% change in that situation, and it had nothing to do with whether the canvasser said they were transgender or not. What it had to do was if the person themselves said that they said positive things about transgender people, not that the other person told them that you should support transgender rights. It was by asking questions and getting that person to come forward with something positive to say. That's the power. So I want to conclude with one story on that. I was working with a police chief and with a civil rights protest leader. And it was over an issue where there had been video footage of an African-American individual being mistreated while in custody. There was a lot of tension in that situation. I was actually surprised because I thought they were getting close to an agreement in the situation. And when I actually asked questions, and again, it was just asking questions and just letting them talk, I asked what was going on. The chief, after saying a lot of things, said a very technical police jargon word. He said, "I was pissed." I was pissed off at the other side because what had happened was, what he explained was, after the last meeting, the leader went in front of the press conference in front of the police station and continued to put the cry of racism against the police department. After talking this through, he was then more open to doing a final meeting, a next meeting on this. I had a separate conversation with the community leader, and I asked, what happened in the last meeting? He went, and I just let him talk, and he went on for a while. And then finally he said, I might have pissed off the police chief. I asked the question as a follow-up, what do you think you should do about it? He hemmed and he hawed for a long period of time, and then ultimately said, I should probably talk to him about it. And when I did bring them together, there was an apology, and there was an agreement that was very good. It was transparent on use of force policies, joint working groups, and that. And to me, that's the work that we can all do. It's the work of listening and helping people persuade themselves. I would also argue that we need to fund organizations that listen and ask questions that bring together communities, like PCRC, like CRS. And I would also say we need leaders to do the same thing. We need leaders who listen and leaders who help resolve community division. These powers are not as cool as the Avengers superpowers, maybe. But not every problem is a nail looking for the hammer, the mighty hammer of Thor. And what I would conclude by saying is that if we all listen, and if we then also really have people find the answer in themselves, we can all join the fight for truth, justice, and the American way. Thank you very much.